The bell above the diner door jingled softly as 7-year-old Earl Washington stepped inside. His heavy brown overcoat hung loosely on his broad shoulders, and the handle of a well-worn cane clutched in his left hand reflected years of steady use. Outside, the early morning fog of Monterey, California, clung to the edges of his silhouette like a ghost. He exhaled quietly, the warmth of his breath visible for a fleeting moment before dissipating into the dimly lit space. The diner was no different than 100 others Earl had been to in his life. Checkered black and white tiles on the floor, red vinyl booth seats, and the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner, playing an old tune that no one seemed to be paying much attention to. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee wafted through the air. Earl smiled faintly at the familiarity, nodding to himself. Familiar was comfortable. The waitress behind the counter glanced up as Earl approached, her name tag reading Tammy in scrawled cursive. She looked to be in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Earl tipped his flat cap at her, his voice polite but warm. "Morning, ma'am," he greeted, leaning lightly on his cane. "Could I get a coffee and maybe take a seat for breakfast?" Tammy's eyes narrowed to slits, glinting like shards of ice as she scrutinized the man standing before her. Every muscle in her body tensed, her posture transforming from casual indifference to an imposing sentinel, ready to confront a foe. Earl could feel the electric charge in the atmosphere, a tautness that hung heavily between them, reminiscent of a tightly wound spring threatening to snap at any moment. He had experienced this eerie stillness too many times in his life, a haunting pause that clawed at his insides, making his heart race in anticipation of what was to come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her lips began to curl upward into a smile, but it was no ordinary smile. It was a chilling mimicry of warmth, devoid of any real emotion, a cruel facade that masked true intentions. It was a smile that sent a shiver racing down Earl's spine, a warning siren in his mind that whispered of danger lurking just beneath the surface. As the seconds ticked by, he knew this moment was more than just an encounter. It was a confrontation laden with unspoken words, simmering tensions, and the palpable dread of an impending storm. The air crackled with unyielding uncertainty, and Earl steeled himself, realizing that he was standing on the precipice of something far more significant than he could have ever anticipated. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clipped, "but we're busy." She gestured vaguely to the half-empty diner, where only a handful of patrons sat scattered amongst the booths and counter stools. Earl raised an eyebrow, glancing around. One man in a suit was hunched over a newspaper, stirring sugar into his coffee. A young couple in the far booth were sharing a plate of pancakes, their conversation hushed. An elderly woman with a walker sat in the corner, sipping tea slowly. Busy? It was not. "Well," Earl said quietly, his voice still even, "it don't seem that crowded. I'll just take a seat here at the counter if that's all right." Tammy hesitated, a torrent of emotion swirling within her as she stood at the counter, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the frayed edges of her apron. The fabric felt like a lifeline, grounding her in the chaos of her thoughts, yet it offered no comfort. The counter's reserved," she stammered, the words tumbling out unconvincingly, like brittle leaves caught in a tempest. Each syllable felt like a weighty stone, pulling her deeper into a pit of anxiety. Her heart raced, pounding against her ribcage like a caged bird desperate for freedom. With a furtive glance, her eyes darted to the other patrons, scanning their faces for validation, for an ally in her web of deception. She imagined their judgment, the whispers of disbelief that might erupt if they sensed the truth lurking beneath her shaky facade. Every second felt elongated, stretching out like the silence before a storm. The atmosphere in the cafe was thick with unspoken tension, and Tammy's breath hitched in her throat as she grappled with the suffocating weight of her lie. What would they think of her if they found out? The thought gnawed at her insides, and for a fleeting moment, she wished to vanish into the shadows, to escape the glaring scrutiny of a world that felt so unforgiving. Earl held her gaze for a long moment, then let out a small sigh. "All right then," he said, stepping back from the counter. "I'll find a booth." He moved slowly, noting the way Tammy's expression flickered with discomfort but not surprise. He chose a booth near the window, sliding awkwardly into the seat as his knees protested the motion. Tammy retreated to the kitchen, leaving Earl sitting alone. Minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Earl rested his hands on the polished surface of the table, his fingers idly tracing the grooves in the wood. The waitress did not return to take his order, nor did she bring the cup of coffee he had requested. He watched as she walked back and forth between the counter and the other tables, serving the few customers who continued to eat their meals in awkward silence. Some of them glanced his way, their expressions betraying unease, but none said a word. The weight of silence pressed against Earl's chest. He had felt this silence before. It was loud, deafening in its refusal to acknowledge what was happening. It was the silence of complicity, of people choosing the comfort of inaction over the discomfort of confrontation. When the doorbell jingled again nearly an hour later, the atmosphere shifted. A young woman entered the diner, her tailored blazer and neatly styled hair a stark contrast to the casual diners around her. She was striking, with deep brown skin and a confident stride that commanded attention. Her eyes scanned the room, searching. Then they stopped, lighting up with recognition as they landed on Earl. "Pop!" she called out with unmistakable joy, her voice slicing through the heavy silence that had settled over the diner. Earl's face broke into a wide grin as he turned to see her. He began to rise from his seat, but she crossed the room quickly, wrapping her arms around him before he could get to his feet. "Hey, baby girl," Earl said softly. His voice carried both pride and relief. He kissed the top of her head, his weathered hands gently patting her shoulders. "You made it." "Of course, I made it," she replied, pulling back to look at him. Her smile faltered slightly as she scanned the empty table. "You didn't order yet." Earl hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly toward Tammy behind the counter before returning to his daughter's concerned face. "Well," he started, "seems they've been busy." Her eyes narrowed, following his glance to the waitress. Tammy had frozen mid-step, her face pale as she took in the scene. The other patrons had gone utterly silent, pretending not to watch while their eyes darted curiously between Earl and his daughter. The young woman's voice grew sharper. "You mean to tell me you've been sitting here all this time and no one bothered to take your order?" Earl reached for her hand, his grip steady, reassuring. "It's all right, June. Let it go." June straightened, her expression tightening. Her voice was anything but calm. "No, it's not all right, Pop." She turned sharply toward the counter, the heels of her shoes clicking loudly on the tiled floor. All eyes were on her as she addressed Tammy directly. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem here?" Tammy blinked, her lips parting soundlessly before she managed to speak. I didn't realize. We were busy and..." June cut her off. "Don't play dumb with me. Why wasn't he served?" The waitress's hands trembled as she clutched her notepad, glancing nervously at the other diners for support. None of them spoke. None of them met her eyes. I messed up. "I'm sorry," she stammered. June nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She reached into her purse and pulled out a laminated card, slapping it onto the counter with an audible thunk. Tammy's eyes widened as she registered the name embossed on it. "June Washington, owner. This is my restaurant." June said evenly, but her voice carried the weight of every ounce of her authority. "This is a place I built with my own two hands, the place I poured my heart and soul into. And you're telling me that you looked at my father, and didn't think he was worth your time? Because I can't think of any other reason why a man like him would sit here for an hour without so much as a coffee." Tammy's eyes brimmed with tears as she stammered, I didn't mean." "Save it," June snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. The question is, why did you think it was okay?" The silence in the diner was suffocating. Earl watched his daughter, his heart swelling with pride even as he wished the moment could pass quietly. Then June turned her attention to the room at large, her eyes ablaze with a fierce intensity that commanded the attention of every soul present. She drew in a breath, her voice rising like a clarion call, reverberating off the walls so that every corner of the space trembled with her words. "And the rest of you," she thundered, the accusation crackling in the air like electricity. "You saw it too. You sat here, complacent and silent, as a man was stripped of his dignity, disrespected in the most grotesque manner. You watched as he was dehumanized, reduced to nothing more than a shadow of himself, and yet you said nothing, not a word, not a murmur of protest. That makes you just as guilty." Her voice crescendoed, a rising tide of righteous fury that swept over the audience, igniting the simmering tension that had hung in the air like an unspoken truth. In that moment, the weight of her words hung heavy, an undeniable challenge echoing through the hearts of those who dared to listen. The truth laid bare. They could no longer hide in the shadows of their indifference. They were complicit in the injustice that had unfolded before their very eyes. A few of the patrons squirmed in their seats, their eyes dropping to their food or their laps. No one spoke. June shook her head, disappointment etched into her features. "This stops here," she said firmly. "I don't care who you are or what you think you know about people based on the color of their skin. No one gets treated like this in my restaurant. Do I make myself clear?" Tammy nodded quickly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry. It'll never happen again, I swear." "I hope not," June replied. Then she turned back to Earl, her expression softening. She extended a hand. "Come on, Pop. We're leaving." Earl rose slowly from his worn armchair, the creaking of the aged wood echoing through the stillness of the room like a mournful sigh. With a hand resting heavily on his intricately carved cane, he summoned the strength to stand tall, his back straightening with the effort. Each deliberate movement was laced with the echoes of a life well lived, and yet burdened by the scars of past choices. He turned to his daughter, Tammy, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears, and for a moment, the world around them faded into a blur. As he paused beside her, he locked eyes with her, a gaze that pierced through the facade of her youthful bravado and laid bare the tangled web of emotions beneath. "Thank you for apologizing," he said gently, his voice a soft murmur that belied the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The air thickened with tension, as if the very walls were leaning in to listen, absorbing the gravity of the moment. "But an apology, my dear, only matters if it changes how you act next time." His words hung in the air, palpable and poignant, a solemn reminder of the lessons learned through hardship and heartache. They resonated like the tolling of a distant bell, echoing through the corridors of time, calling forth a reckoning. Earl's heart ached, not just for the mistakes that had driven a wedge between them, but for the hope that this moment could mark a turning point, a chance for redemption, for growth, for healing. In that charged silence, the weight of his experience bore down on them both, a reminder that the path to forgiveness was fraught with challenges, yet illuminated by the flickering flame of understanding. Tammy nodded again, unable to meet his gaze. Earl's hand rested on June's shoulder as they walked toward the door. As they passed the other diners, Earl turned his head slightly, addressing the room without looking at anyone in particular. "Silence can speak louder than words," he said quietly. "But courage can, too. Remember that." The doorbell jingled as they left, the fog outside swallowing them whole. It was a long while before anyone in the diner spoke again.